In this video, we're going to do a crash course on CSS, or cascading style sheets. So last time we built the basic skeleton of a page using HTML, we built all the content, and now we can actually lay it out and control the presentation or the visual look of the page. So let's go ahead and go live and open this up from last time in a browser. So this is what we're starting with, and we're going to want to do a few things to control how this looks. So we can write CSS in a couple of different ways. The first way I'll show you is that directly in the head of your HTML, we can open up a style tag, and inside of here we can insert some CSS. So it'll look like this code here, where we're going to have a selector. We're going to say what piece of HTML we want to change the style of. We will have this block that's denoted by the curly brackets, and then we'll put some style declarations in there. So this says that all buttons should have a text color of blue. So let's see that. We've got, let's maybe take our page. We are going to change the color of the background of the page, and then we'll change the color of the text. So let's start with body. So we are saying every body element on the page, and there is only one, should be given this style, whatever we put inside of the opening and closing curly brackets here. So let's say the background dash color is, since Visual Studio gives us the ability to have a color picker, I'm just going to type white to get a color in there, so Visual Studio will recognize it. And then if I hover over this word, I get a color picker where I can change the alpha, so the transparency here, and I can also use the slider to change the color. So let's maybe do a really dark purple, and then save it, and we'll see our page re-renders. So now the body, the background of the whole page, let me resize this so it's a little bit smaller, is that dark color. And if we want the text to be visible, we're going to change a different property, which would be the color property. So this is the color of text. And maybe we will also just temporarily make these links white as well. So I'm going to say all hyperlinks on the page, all A tags, will also have a color of white, so we can see everything. Let's take a snapshot of this and break down the structure of CSS in a whiteboard. So let's grab snapshot. And open up a new whiteboard. Okay, so we've got a couple of components here. We have the selector, or I'll also show you that multiple selectors can go here and can be comma separated. So this is saying these rules that we're about to define, what should they target on the page? And right now this is saying target every body element on the page, and this is saying target every anchor element that's on the page. And then our rules inside of this block, which the opening and closing brackets here define what is called a declaration block, and then each line is a style declaration, and they all follow the same format. So let's go ahead and mark this. We have the property, colon, and then the value, and then semicolon at the end. So every line of CSS will have this general, every style declaration that we make inside of these blocks will have this structure where it's property, colon, value, semicolon. And so as we can see here with these brackets, opening curly bracket and closing curly bracket, we can have a bunch of CSS rules that apply to whatever selector we put in here. So let's switch back to our code. And this is one way that we can define style. The other way, which we're now going to move to, and we're going to leave the style tag behind, is to grab this. I'm going to hit Control X to cut it and delete this style. And we're going to create a new folder called CSS. And inside of that folder, I'm going to create a new file called main.css and paste in the style here. So if I go back to About and I save this and I check out my page, we're back to our original styles. And if we want to tell about.html and tell the browser when it loads about.html to go ahead and grab this styling, this CSS file and apply these styles, we go in here into the head and we use a link tag. And Emmet, the extension that's by default in Visual Studio Code, gives you a couple of options for different types of assets you can link. And we want link this CSS one. So I'm going to scroll down, hit enter, and then the href, we need to pass in the path to get from this file into this folder and down to main.css. So it's going to be //css main.css. Save it, and if we check it out in our browser, we should be back to having that styling being applied. So like with HTML, we had MDN and we had W3 schools pulled up as our references. There are a couple useful references for CSS. So MDN, so pull this up. This is their CSS reference page, which lists all of the possible properties that you can set to different values. So if I search here for color, we can see there's a background color, which is the one that we used, and we can look through and see their documentation like, oh, here are all these different ways that we could have specified the background color. We could have used the keyword, a hex value, we could have said RGB and then specified the red, green, blue value. Could have said RGB with an alpha to specify the transparency, hue, saturation, lightness, alpha. So this documentation will be incredibly helpful for you in unpacking the possibilities for CSS, because you have a lot of options of properties and then a lot of options for the different ways that you can specify the value for certain properties. So this page is really good for just browsing through some of the CSS properties that you can manipulate. There is also this website called Cssreference.io, which is a visual guide to specifying some of these properties. So for instance, let's look up background color. And it gives you some small examples of how you can set the background color along with a rendered view of what that looks like. Let's check out another one. Let's look up border. So you can also specify borders around elements, which we'll talk about in a second, but this is giving you a visual reference for what the different border styles look like. So I think this is a really great resource for getting started with CSS, in addition to MDN, and I'll also pull up the W3 schools. And I'll make sure that these are in the canvas along with this video. So here's another one. Here's the CSS reference. You can just go through and check out some of these when you're looking for how to do something in CSS. So let's go through. Let's say that, you know, this page is fine, but we want to make the text bigger. So maybe we would then use one of these and search for font size or just size. And here we go. We can see that this specifies the size of the font. And there are a couple different options. We can specify pixels. We can use a keyword. We can use a percentage. There are also M values and rem values, which we'll dig into a little bit more later. So we're going to just start with pixels. And if we flip back to our main.css, let's say we are targeting our HTML element and we want to change the font size. So maybe let's say the font size for the HTML element should be 20 pixels. And let me pull this up side by side so we can see what happens as I save it. Or we could drop it down to 10 pixels. So this might be a little confusing at first, that we are changing a property of the HTML element, and somehow the styling for the H1, the H2, and the paragraphs and lists are all changing. This is because some styles are inherited. So when we set a style like font size on the HTML element, that means that every child element of HTML also inherits this font size by default. So let's check this out a little bit more in depth in the browser. So in one of the earlier videos, I popped open the developer tools. Now I want you to actually be able to do this yourself. So it is under the menu here in Chrome, more tools, and then developer tools. So you can hit F12 or Control-Shift-I to open the developer tools. And then the developer tools have a couple of tabs. I demoed the network tab so that we could snoop on all the files that were loaded, but now we want to spend our time in the elements tab, which this shows us a tree of our HTML. You can see as I'm hovering over elements, it is highlighting them over in the browser for me. And then importantly, when we have one of these selected, like if I select the HTML, I can see all the CSS rules that have been applied to that HTML. We are going to see some rules that come from the user agent style sheet, which means these are the default styles that are coming from the browser. And then we are going to see some styles that are coming from our CSS. So here we can see main.css, line 1, or not line 1. Oh yeah, actually it's telling us it's from line 1, and if I click on it, it'll take me to the sources tab and show me that CSS that's been loaded. So we can see where each style comes from, and we can actually manipulate these. So if I was looking at this, I'm like, well, that's a little larger than I wanted. I could manipulate this on the fly, say this is 18 pixels instead of 20, and this is just modifying what's been loaded in memory in the browser. So if I flip back to my style here, this is still at 20. So we have not changed our code itself. We are just manipulating the in-browser memory and the in-browser setting for font size. So if I come back here and I save this and set it to 22, it's going to reload the page using our live server and override those changes that we made. So any kind of changes that you're making here, like toggling on and off, changing the value, these are temporary. They're really useful if you want to explore small tweaks to your design. Like if this color were bugging me, maybe I would want to use the selector inside of here to find maybe a new dark purple value that I like. And then if I wanted to keep that and put it into my code, I would have to flip back to my CSS, go to where I defined the background color, and paste that in. So there are a couple of things that this tool lets us see, and one of them is seeing the inherited styles. So if I go ahead, let's just find maybe our hyperlink here for quiz, and I look at the styling here, I can see some of the styling is coming from our main.css where we set the color to white. Some of it is coming from user agent styling, the default browser styling in Chrome for hyperlinks, and some of it is being inherited. So we can see some of this was inherited from body, and some, including the font size, was inherited from HTML. So I can see what it looks like to toggle off that HTML setting, which we've done before. So we can see a little bit of the inheritance here. So this is a good way to debug your styles. The other thing that we can see, this is indicating that there have been some styles that have been applied that are overriding previous styles. And we can see that a little bit more directly if I flip back to our HTML here, and let's create two rules for the body. And let's say this one sets the color to red. So we now have two CSS declarations applied to the body that are both competing for setting the color. And there are a lot of ways in which the CSS cascades, and it figures out which CSS should apply for a particular rule. There's only ever going to be one color setting that's going to take hold for the body. So the browser needs to figure out what is the appropriate order in which to apply them to determine what is the rule that is ultimately the one that gets applied. So here, in a single CSS file, the rule is that if you have two selectors that have the same specificity, we'll talk about specificity later. For now, just trust me that these are the same specificity. The last rule wins. So because I put red down here after white, red is what's going to win. And if we go back to our inspector here, and we click on the body and we look at the rules, we can see the white here is crossed out and the red is the one that takes hold. And so if I just flip these, we have now reversed it. So white is the last rule that was applied to the body. And so red is now crossed out and white is the rule that gets applied. All right, let's get rid of this extra declaration of color. And let's look at one more thing that's really useful inside of the developer tools. So we've seen how to select elements, and there's also a button that allows you to hover over elements and select them on the page. But the button right next to it, the toggle device toolbar, allows us to view our page in a couple of different modes. So your default Chrome installation is going to have a couple of presets here, and then you can also create your own presets. So here is the Pixel 2 phone screen and how our web page would look on that phone screen, the Galaxy 5 or the iPhone 5. There's also a responsive mode, which has these handles that allows us to resize the page dynamically and see how our page looks on different sized devices. When we get into responsive design and thinking about multiple screen sizes as our targets, this emulator will be really, really important. Okay, I'm going to turn off the device emulator and let's go back to our CSS and we can add some comments. CSS is a different language than HTML, so comments are going to look a little bit different, but if you hit Control// you will get the syntax for a comment. It starts with /* and ends with star or asterisk /. So anything between these two lines will get ignored. So we could put like a title at the top here and say the main style for our quiz game. And we could put a note in here. Font size is a property that is inherited. And maybe we could add a comment in here to say you can apply multiple style declarations inside of a block. So comments, they function the same way as in HTML. We use them to leave notes to ourselves, our future selves, and explain the code that we wrote. We also use them to communicate with other developers, but the browser does not care about these comments. So if I flip back, nothing has changed by me putting those comments in there. So before we add a few more style properties to our CSS, I want to explain two fundamental principles in how CSS works. So one is called the box model, and the other, it has to do with the display property and how elements are laid out on the page. So let's start with visualizing here all of the boxes that are on our page. So this rule is a rule that applies to all elements. Asterisk means match any element, whereas here this only matches HTML. And I'm just doing this for demo purposes. We wouldn't really want to do this in production. Let's put a 2-pixel solid border around everything on our page. So what that lets us see is the box for every element on our page. We can also use this inspector to sort of highlight individual blocks. So we can see here, this is our H1, here's our H2, here are our individual LIs, here's our image. And the key takeaway is just that everything is laid out as a box on our web page. And now that we can see those boxes, we can see some properties about those boxes. So some of these boxes, like the word quiz and about me, show up on the same line. And some of these boxes, like about me, take up the whole line. Same, we've got a box here for our paragraph, which takes up the whole line, but this hyperlink here is a smaller box that's within that line. And same thing for our image here. That image has a box that is just the size of the image. It's not a box that takes up the whole line. So the display property in CSS lets us control how things are laid out. And there are kind of two big categories. There's inline and there is block. So anything like this H1 here that takes up the whole line is considered a block element, and anything like these links that are sitting inline and allow things to sit on either side of them are inline elements. And there's some important differences for inline versus block elements. So inline elements, let me just go ahead and highlight one of them. Let's grab this hyperlink. And if I click in here, this is giving me a set of styles that I can add inside of the developer tools. So this is not being added to our project files themselves. This is just in memory. I can write some rules in here that just get applied to this element. So we haven't talked about it yet, but there's a width and a height element, a CSS property. And if I try setting the width and height on this inline element, you can see that they're being disregarded. So inline elements, their width and height are set by their content, like how much text is inside of here, and the width and height attributes are just ignored. But if I go ahead and grab the width and height, so I'm going to turn them off here, and I go to a block element like this about me, and I paste in the width and height, we can see that those do get respected. So now the box that's around about me is 200 pixels wide and 200 pixels tall. So there's some key differences between block and inline elements, and you'll want to be careful about which you choose when you're laying out your elements on your page. So let me get rid of these, and let me pull up a hyperlink that I will make sure is also in the canvas. So this is W3 Schools, and they have a nice layout that explains the block versus inline elements. And these are some examples of elements in HTML that default to block. So UL, LI, paragraph, these all default to taking up as much of the width as they can, and they don't allow other things to exist on the same line by default. And then we have inline elements, which include things like span and image and anchor, which do allow neighbors to sit on either side of them. And these inline elements only take up as much width as necessary, so setting the width and height, those get ignored. So let's flip back to our CSS and take control of how things are laid out. So we're probably going to uncomment, or we're probably going to comment out some of this code because it'll just be for demo purposes. But remember, we saw that paragraph, UL, and LI are all things that are by default display of block. And if we use the display property to set them to inline, and save it, and check out our page, those things that were previously here taking up multiple lines have now been allowed to sit on the same line, and they will only take up as much space as they need based on their content. So this isn't terribly useful as is, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to uncomment this so we can go back to what we had before. Things are laying out a little bit more readably. But I want to highlight a couple of things here. So one is that we can target this styling to multiple elements by just having the name of the element and then comma, the name of the element, comma. So as long as we use comma as a separator, we can actually apply CSS to multiple elements in one. And let's add a couple of notes here. So let's say some elements default to block, or some elements that default to block. P-U-L-L-I, nav. Some elements that default to inline. A span image. So if we wanted to, we could do a similar thing here and say, okay, now we want the A, the span, and the image. Let's flip that. Let's have those display as block. Save it. We check out the page. We can now see that salt, fat, acid, heat is now not sitting in this paragraph. It is blocking, and the period sits after it, and the previous sentence sits before it. And same thing with our nav, which had hyperlinks in it. So now quiz, this separator, and about me are all sitting on separate lines. So let's go ahead and undo that. So now that we have this idea that elements are laid out in block or inline, and those affect how much space they take up on the page and whether they can have neighbors or not, let's look at the box model. So I'm going to actually put a title here. Let's say inline versus block. And then let's put a comment here for the box model. So we saw that everything is laid out as a box, but there's a little bit more to the box model than that. So let's say our H1, let's give it a background of white, a border, 2 pixels, solid, black. Actually, we'll make it a little bit bigger. Let's make it 10 pixels. We are going to add something called padding. Let's give it 20 pixels of padding and margin 100 pixels. And since our text we set to be white up here, and if we have a white background, whoops, let's make this background color. That'll be a little bit hard to read, so let's make the color for the H1 black. So we can save this and flip back to our browser. And we can see those changes. So we can see the about me, there's some space around it before the border, there's 10 pixels of black border, and then there's some margin around that. So the best way to see a visualization of the box model is actually to slide our developer tools over, and now we can see at the bottom here a representation of the aspects of the box model. So we have the interior, which is our content, which has been sized to fit the about me. Then we have around that 20 pixels of padding. That is just extra space between the content and the border. We have our border, which is 10 pixels, and then we have 100 pixels of margin around that. So we can actually play with the settings here. So we could say, what if it had 50 pixels of padding? Or what if it had 5 pixels of padding? And padding and margin both have this syntax where you can specify. Most commonly, you will see it either specified with 1 value, or you will see it with 2 values. So if I say 0, 50 pixels, that is saying 0 on the top and bottom, but 50 pixels on the left and right. Or you'll often see it as 4 values. So let's do 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 40 pixels. This doesn't make sense in our design, but just for illustration purposes, so the 10 pixels is on the top, then it's 20 pixels on the right, 30 pixels on the bottom, 40 pixels on the left. The easiest way to remember that is that it's clockwise from top all the way around. So top, right, bottom, left. And the same thing for the margin. We could grab those same values and paste them in here, and those 4 properties, 2 properties, 1 property, you can use the same kind of syntax for both margin and padding. Okay, so that's enough playing around with this box model and how things are laid out on the page. That gives us enough to go on as we're designing the rest of our page. I'm going to flip back and let's say this is the box model demo. Let's comment this out. So I'm just selecting multiple lines by clicking and dragging, and then hit Control/, and let's also I'm going to grab this and Alt and then hit the down arrows to bubble this down. And let's put this under our box model demo. And that looks good. So if we save it and go back, we're back to the base that we had before. And now we can start using some of our CSS knowledge to actually format some things in a more useful way. So one thing that is bugging me and might be bugging you is that our content is all the way over against the left side of the screen. And it doesn't really make sense to be there. We might want it to be centered. And there's a way that we can do that. So if I flip back, I'm going to put some space here. And let's just focus on our body. So we want to, by default, the body is a block element, so it's going to take up the whole page. What we kind of want to do is shrink this body down a little bit and then move it to the center of the page. So we can set the width, say, to 800 pixels. And if we look at what that does, now we can see our body is this area here, and then it is blocking the rest of the line, so it's got this extra space around it. And one way that we can take block elements and center them, so this only applies to block elements, is to apply a margin. We're going to say we want 0 margin on the top and bottom, and we want auto margin on the left and right. So auto means take the space that's around this block element and divide it up evenly. So if I save it, now we have this body element that has this auto margin on the left and right hand side to make sure that the page is actually centered. So this works, this width here of 800 and margin, this allows us to center block elements. But what happens if this is viewed on, say, like a mobile device where the window is really small? In that case, the width is not actually a useful value to set. And we might actually want to set the max width. So max width is a property that says, this can be anything up to 800 pixels, but it's allowed to be smaller. So here, now we have something that on big screens is 800 pixels wide, and as we go ahead and scale this down, instead of our body giving us a giant horizontal scroll bar that allows us to scroll 800 pixels left and right, we now have something where the body is being capped by the device size. So this page will actually look, semi-okay on mobile devices as compared to before when we were setting the width directly to the 800. So you have width and height properties, and you also have max and min width and height properties that allow you to constrain the size. So I'm going to add a comment in here that this margin auto trick centers block elements. Okay, so looking at this, it's looking a little bit better with having the content centered on the page. The other thing that has a big effect is changing the font that we're using. So we changed the size so that it's a little bit bigger, and now we can change the font to make sure that we pick something that we're happy with. So the property there, let's go through the process of reading documentation for this. So the property that we're looking for, you might think starts with font dash, and it is font family. So font dash family. And if we look through it, it's telling us that this specifies the font for an element, and we have a couple of ways that we can specify it. So we can actually specify the name of a font, like Times New Roman in quotation marks, or we can specify a generic family, like serif, sans serif, cursive, fantasy, monospace. And these will just pull from the these will tell the browser to pull, whichever one is available on the user's computer, as opposed to if we specified something like Helvetica as the font name, that would only work on computers where Helvetica is actually installed, which would be Macs, but usually not Windows machines. So let's try one of these generic family names first. So let's say the font family is monospace. As you can see, now it looks, the code actually, or it looks more like code, because in Visual Studio we're using a monospaced font. And if I go ahead and select the body again, so we've got font family monospace, we could play with some of the other settings here. So there's cursive, which is going to load, actually we can see if we go down to computed and we scroll to the bottom, we can see which font the browser chose. So here it chose Comic Sans. We could try Fantasy. I think this is going to load Impact. Yeah, it loads Impact. Or you can choose a serif font, which has these serif elements around the caps of the letters, or a sans serif, which doesn't have those. So let's go back to our documentation, because there's another thing that is useful to point out with font family, is that normally you would specify a stack. So you would specify a font like Arial, and if that's not available on the computer, the browser is going to go to the next one, Helvetica. And if that's not available, it's going to go to the last one. And the last one you would usually specify as a generic family name. So here we're specifying a sans serif stack, which if you're a Windows machine will load Arial, if you're a Mac will load Helvetica, and if for some reason you don't have either of those, it'll just pull whatever sans serif your computer has available. So we could do something like Century Gothic. And if we flip back to our browser and check it out, we have a sans serif font that has been loaded, but we would want to also add a fallback there and say sans serif for computers that don't have Century Gothic installed on them. So this is well and good if we only want to play with fonts that are already installed on someone's computer. But there's a service, Google Fonts, which has a bunch of fonts that are open source or licensed for use online, which you can bring into your project really easily. So let's say I want to grab, I'll grab PT Sans, and I want to use this in my project. So I click on the font that I want, and then I need to select which font styles I think that I will need in my project. So here, I'm just going to go ahead and grab all of these. So I'm going to grab the normal weight font, the italic version, the bold version, and the bold italic version. And then over in the sidebar here, we can see it's showing me my selection. I can remove individual elements, I could add them back in. And then under the embed tab, it gives you two ways that you can include this into your project. So one is to add a link element into your HTML, which will go when the HTML loads, it'll say like, oh, we need this other resource. I'm going to go pull this from fonts.googleapis.com. Or you can use an import rule, which this does a similar thing, but does it from the CSS. Since we're going to move, when we move into React and build pipelines, the optimization about which of these you would choose won't matter as much for us. So for this, I'm just going to go for simplicity and grab this import, which goes into our CSS. So I'm going to drop this here at the top of our CSS, which is saying go to this URL and go to Google APIs and pull this PT Sans, the different weights. And then if I flip back here, we can see here is the rule it's telling us we should probably use if we want to specify this is the font we use. So font family, and then in quotation marks, PT Sans, and then as a backup, sans serif. So I'm going to grab that. I'm going to drop that in here as well. And we can comment out the old font family that we were using and check out our page. So now we are using PT Sans, and if you want to verify which font got loaded, you could scroll down to Computed and see PT Sans, and it's telling us now this is a network resource, that it went and downloaded it from somewhere, as opposed to before when we had Century Gothic and we looked at Computed, it's telling us this is coming from a local file. Flip back, let's turn PT Sans back on. So since we saw that font weight was a thing, with our imports here in Google Fonts, that there was a 400 font weight and a 700 font weight, it's useful to at least mention that that is another property that you can use to style things. So if I wanted, actually let's just apply this to maybe our list. So I'm going to grab my UL here, and I'm going to say font weight, And then there are numbers available from 100 all the way up to 900. 400 is the same thing as specifying this normal keyword down here, and 700 is the same thing as specifying this bold keyword. So you can see at 400, nothing has changed, but if I type in 700 here, we will now trigger loading that bold font that we pulled in here. And you can also specify how whether the text is italic or not using the text style. Font style italic. Okay, so let's flip back to our code. I'm going to save this, and now we can start styling some other elements. So we have in our HTML, I'm going to, there's a hotkey here for opening up the command palette, and then fold. You can fold different levels. So fold 1 is Control K, Control 1. Fold 2 is Control K, Control 2. So let's fold Control K, Control 3. So we can see the structure here. We've got header, main, footer. And then also, in case you're curious of how to unfold everything, I'm pulling up the command prompt, typing unfold, or typing fold, and we can see Control K, Control J unfolds them. Control K, Control J, whoops. Control K, Control J unfolds it. So I want to target some of the stuff in the header here and some of the stuff in the footer here. And if we look at our page, what I want to do is this header, I kind of want to add some more space between our navigation and the actual content of our page. And then I also want to add some space. It looks a little weird with this footer here right against this image. And I think I probably want to adjust the size of some of these things. So maybe I'll pump the size up of this logo, and maybe pump the size up of some of this navigation as well. So let's flip back to our code. The header and footer are easy to target. And then when we want to actually change like the size of this, we're going to have to come back and learn something new in terms of our HTML knowledge. So let's start with the header and footer. So with the header, let's say I want to add, let's do margin bottom. Oh, let's do it this way. So this is right, bottom, or sorry, top, right, bottom, left. That looks decent. So I'm using a different kind of unit here. The rem unit stands for the root M size. And so basically it's a way to refer to the root font size of our page. And the nice thing about that is, let's make this like 10 rem, just so that we can illustrate it. If I go back to my browser here and I change this root font size, this space between this text and this text is proportional to whatever the root font size is, which that does not work if I had gone in here and said instead of 10 rem, I had specified this to be 10 pixels or 100 pixels. As I go ahead and sort of scale my design down, that space is always going to be 100 pixels, which maybe looked right at one size, but doesn't look right at other sizes. So oftentimes I like to set up elements to be sized based on this root font size, because then it gives you a nice easy handle to make your site a little bit more responsive by just changing the root font size. So I'm using rem units here, and I did the long syntax where we're specifying that there's zero margin everywhere except for the bottom. But what we can do is actually use, there are margin left, margin right, top, and bottom properties. So if we just need to set the margin bottom and leave the other ones alone, I can just say margin bottom to rem, and that will have the same effect. So I think also what I want to do is take all of this text and center it. And one easy way to do that is to say text align. And then here we have a couple of properties. We have center and justify left, right. And here I just want to center that text. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. Let's do the same thing to the footer. So we could specify the full margin syntax, but I can just say margin top, and we're going to put the same amount of spacing. Let's do 2 rem, which will drop it down. And let's also text align center. So now all the content of our footer is centered. And let's also, let's make it italic. So we saw before that we could do font size italic. So that's looking a little bit better. So now let's deal with, I want to change the size of this element. So if I inspect it, this span is what I want to target. And I also want to maybe change the size of all of the nav elements here. And we'll run into a problem. Right now, we've been doing a lot of styling that is based on targeting what is called an element selector. So where we just specify the name of our element. But there can be pages that have multiple headers and multiple footers. There can be pages that have multiple hyperlinks and multiple divs, and sometimes you just want to target one of those elements or a set of those elements, and there are 2 ways that we can do that, introducing the concept of IDs and the concept of classes. So we're going to start with the concept of IDs. So this requires us to go back into our HTML, and we can add a new attribute to our span called ID, and we can call this logo. And this nav, we could go ahead and add an ID and call this main-nav. So one of the common syntaxes for, or conventions for naming IDs and classes in CSS is to do what is called kebab case, where if we have something that has multiple words, like this we could say is called our trivia logo, is each word is separated with a dash. So we could, if we had 3 words here, it'd be like header, main, nav. We would make them all lowercase and we'd have dashes between them. When we move into the React world, there'll be a different convention. So I'm not super worried at this point with everyone being able to follow this convention, but I want you to be aware of it in case you end up working in HTML and CSS in the future. So I'm going to trim these down a little bit. I'm going to go back to, this is logo and main nav. And so adding an ID to these, the idea for an ID is that it is a unique identifier. So that means that there should only be one element on your page that has this ID. So here we only have one thing with an ID of logo and one thing with an ID of main nav. When we get to classes, we'll see how to specify things that could apply to multiple elements on your page, but an ID is for one unique element. So once we've installed these IDs on these elements, we can come back to our CSS and now we can target them. So if I want to style that logo, I just say #logo, and this means apply whatever rules to the ID named logo. And this needs to match exactly whatever your ID was. So same thing here for main nav. So let me pull these up side by side. So I want to change the font size. Maybe let's try 1.5 rem. Maybe a little bit bigger, 2 rem. Okay, that's not bad. And our main nav, let's size this up. Font size 1.1 rem. Yeah, that looks fine. So we've got styles that are applied just to these elements. Let's see what it looks like if we have styles that we want to apply to multiple elements. So let's go back to our about and unfold our main here. Let's say we have another list on our page. And this is some languages I am writing. We can put in HTML, CSS, JS. Check out our page. So let's say, this is a website. We've got a whole bunch of lists on our website, but these two we want to apply some common styles to. Like maybe we want to change this bullet to be an emoji. So one way to do that in our current setup would be to apply a class. So we are going to say class equals. So this is going to be a class attribute. Let's call this emoji list. And do the same thing for our other UL. So now that we have these defined, we can switch back to our CSS, and this will allow us to target just those elements that have that class applied to them. So we can say emoji list. So the way to indicate in our selector that we're talking about a class is with dot. And there are a couple ways that we can change. There are a number of list properties that we can change. So I could say list-style, and there are a whole different set of presets. So like maybe we wanted to use Greek. We can see that it's now using Greek letters. Or I can say none, and those bullets have disappeared completely. Or like lower Roman to get Roman numerals. And you can see all of these if you go check out some of the HTML or some of the CSS references like W3 Schools or MDN. You'll be able to see those. I kind of want to show you a trick for replacing these with emoji. So let's set this. I'm going to leave this one here for reference, but let's set the list style to none. So we are now removing that bullet, and what we are putting in looks like this, where we are going to say emoji list space li. So this, when we have selectors that are separated by space here, this means that if there is something called emoji list, something with a class name emoji list that has an li within it, we are now targeting that li. So if we, for instance, had an li here that was not inside of an emoji list, this one will not be targeted by the styling rule that we're just about to apply. So just for demo purposes, let's see that in action. So let's just make the font style italic so that we can see something on the page. So we can see these list items, because they're inside of an emoji list, got turned into italic, and this one did not. So let's go back here. I'm going to get rid of this. And we don't really want to set the font style to italic. The other thing I want to show you is something called a pseudo element. So if we tack on before here to li, that means that we are actually, through CSS, able to add some content to our page that happens right before each list item. So if I go ahead and say content and drop in an emoji, let's do the pointing finger. We can see that now we have inserted this emoji before each list item. And if I want to add some space between here and each item in our list, we could do padding. And remember, with padding, we could specify 4. So if I wanted to specify just the right, so this is top, this would be the right, I could say like 0.5 rem, and that adds a little bit of space. But the other way to do this is to just say padding right. So like with margin, we can just specify padding right directly, And there we go. We got two lists that now are formatted with emoji instead of the default bullets. So I want to show you a couple more things before we wrap up this CSS introduction. And one of them is background. So you saw me at some point fall into using background instead of background-color. And background is a complex property. So let's pull up our handy reference. Let's do CSS Background. And often if you just search for the property that you're looking for in CSS, you will get W3 schools and MDN as some of the references. So if we check out W3 schools, we can see that background, you can specify a color, which we've been doing. You can also specify an image, and you can choose how that image repeats, where it's attached, the size of that image. Let's see, they don't have any good, oh, here we go. So let's go to background image and take a look. So you can see that they have this paper GIF that is then being repeated as the background. And I think what I want to do is replace the background. Instead of using a solid color here, we'll use like a subtle background that can be the backdrop for our game and our about page. So one of the sites I like to use is subtle background. So if you Google search subtle background, or it's actually called subtle patterns. If you Google search subtle patterns, you will find this website that has a whole bunch of different repeating patterns that you can go ahead and download, and then you can include them in your project. So I have downloaded one of them already, and I'm gonna go ahead and let's grab it. Grab my downloads folder, and I'm also gonna put this into, let's close all these for a second. I'm gonna grab it and drag it into my images folder. And so this is one of those patterns that I just dimmed a little bit in Photoshop, but you can grab whatever image you want. There are also sites that allow you to generate a background pattern by composing a bunch of icons together. That's an option. Any image will work. It's just a matter of getting a low contrast one that won't be distracting or jarring to use as a background. So I'm going to go into my main.css, and we are going to use this syntax for background image, where we're going to specify a URL, and that URL will point to our images folder and Memphis colorful. So instead of using this color here, I'm going to change this to be background and URL, and then we are using our local path. So we are in main.css. So we actually need to go up a directory, then into images, and then to Memphis colorful. So the way that we would specify that is 2 dots means go up one directory, then slash, then we would say go into images / Memphis colorful dim. And if I save this and check it out in our browser, we can see that background is now being loaded. Great. And our color for everything, now it needs to change to a different color. So let's choose a darker color. And one tip for choosing font colors is that usually completely black is not a good choice. Usually you want to choose a color that's slightly less black. Maybe I'll go for a very dark steel blue. Save that, check it out. That's looking fine. What we're going to do is learn how to style links. So this was our demo code for just making sure the links turned white on our dark background. We can get rid of that now, and we will learn how to style links. So this is looking better. This will look a little cleaner than what we started with. One thing I want to point out is that, when I was pulling up the reference here, this is using background image. The background property allows you to specify multiple of the background properties all together. So you can specify the image and the size and the attachment, and you can specify multiple backgrounds. So if you're interested in learning more about backgrounds, definitely check out the reference. We only have time to do a real quick overview at the moment. So we have our background. Now let's go ahead and learn how to style links, which will introduce another really important concept called pseudo classes. So let's go down here. We are going to style all anchor tags, and there are a couple pseudo elements that we need. Pseudo classes. So whereas before we were using a pseudo element to sort of inject content on the page before a list item, you can also inject content after an element that's on the page. Pseudo classes allow us to style elements when they're in a particular state. So this would be the base link state. This is an unvisited link, which happens to be the default. Visited link that, or focused link, and a hovered link. So links are this type of thing, if we flip back to our browser, that should have multiple states. It's become common convention that when a link is visited, it's a different color than when it's not visited. So the user who is on your website knows where they've been and where they haven't been. And it's also common, like here I am clicking on my link and it's changing color to indicate that I am currently clicking on it. It's a useful piece of feedback to give to the user. And then I'm hitting tab to toggle through my app, and this is the default focus state where I have an element selected using my keyboard, which is very useful for accessibility purposes and also useful for like power users that want to use their keyboard as opposed to a mouse to navigate the page. So we want to restyle those, but we want to be mindful of keeping that feedback there for those different states. So I think what I want to do is make it so that the links have a transparent background or a transparent background color. And then when we hover or focus on them or click on them, that the background becomes visible and the color flips to white. So that'll make more sense as we start to code it, but that's the idea. So what I want to do is, for this link, let's have the basic style. This gets applied before any of these other pseudo elements or pseudo classes get applied. So we are going to add a property here called transition. And we are going to transition the color and background color. So we'll see what this does in a second, but transition allows us to say that when an element switches a property value, like color or background color, that it shouldn't happen immediately. It should actually animate over a certain amount of time as it's changing. So let's change the unvisited state. I'm going to make the background color transparent. And let's set the color. I want like a purple color for my links, but I want it to be brighter than this. Maybe something like that. And when we are a link that has been visited, I want to make sure that we preserve that same styling difference. So I'm going to just copy my color here and darken it a little bit. And then when we are in our focused or hovered state, this is where I want to take our color and switch it to be the background color and make our, I want to make our color white and our background color be this purple color. So when we are focused, I will make the background color this and make our color white. And we'll do the same thing for hover. So let's flip back and see how it looks. So we have our elements that now are a slightly different shade of purple pink, and when we hover over them or when I click on them, we get different styling. And the animation that's happening is coming from this transition. So now we can talk about transition a little bit. So here, you know, it's snapping to its new state. And then if I turn on the transition, now it's transitioning when I hover or click on one of these links. And the speed at which it transitions, you can configure. So here, if I want to slow down, this doesn't look great as far as user interface. You usually want it to be a bit snappier, a bit more snappy than that. So maybe like 0.1. That looks decent to me. So transition, you can set up multiple properties to be animated when they change in these pseudo states. So just so that we have it written down somewhere in our code, let's say, you know, link is a pseudo class. And up here, let's add a note to say before is a pseudo element. So I'm just scratching the surface on these. There are other pseudo classes and other pseudo elements that are useful as you're designing more complicated designs or creating more complicated designs. I want to cap this off with doing a little bit more with pseudo classes, with buttons, things that we'll then be able to hook up to some JavaScript to do some fun stuff on our page. So to make this work, let's go back to our About page, and under let's put it above our image. I want to add 2 buttons. And the first one is going to be, let's make this the click button. And this one will be the speak button. So when we switch over to the next video to learn a little bit of JavaScript, we will hook up some JavaScript to run when we click this button, and it'll keep track of how many times the button has been clicked. And this button, we will go ahead and have it actually speak something through our browser. And we'll see a little bit about the audio API, the speech recognition and speech synthesis APIs. But for these, let's go ahead and we'll install an ID. Let's call this the click button, and an ID for the speak button. So if I save this and we check them out in the browser, oh, actually, these I don't want showing up side by side with our image here. I want them actually to be on their own line here. And we're going to change that in our CSS. But this is the default styling for buttons. So let's flip back here to main, and let's scroll down after our link. So we've got our click button and our speak button. So both of these I want to make display block. So buttons are normally display inline, but here I want them to take up their own line. If I switch back, we can see, there we go, click and speak and image are all on separate lines now. And then I want to add some space around the click and speak button. So you know what, since I'm going to do this for both of them, let's create a new rule here that actually applies to both click button and speak button. That is display block, and let's do margin. I want 1 rem of margin on the top and bottom. Yeah, 1 rem of margin on the top and bottom. Save this, flip back, and now we have 1 rem of margin above, below, above, below. So with this speak button, let's start there. And the buttons can also have these pseudo classes applied to them. So if we do speak button hover or speak button active, these would be if we're pressing down or hovering over the button, this additional style will be applied. And let's have speak button. So here we're going to set up some default styles, and then if we end up being hovered or active, we will apply the other styles here. And I want to show you a fun one, which is the transform property. So with transform, you can scale and rotate and set up perspective on elements. So I'll just demo that. Let's say scale and rotate 15 degrees. So now we have a button that has been scaled up and rotated, and we can use that instead of applying this transform here, if we apply it on hover or active and make sure that it's scaled to 1 and has a 0 rotation. Now when we hover over the button, this button twists and scales up. Maybe we'll drop this down a little bit. And if we want this to actually smoothly transition from scale of 1 to 1.1 and rotation of 0 to 5 degrees, we can use our transition. So we say transition, the transform, and let's do 1.15 seconds. Whoops, I meant to say 0.15 seconds. There we go. So that's a little bit of fun stuff that we can do with the transform. And to cap it off, I will just run through this quickly. I don't expect you to necessarily get all of this one the first time, but with CSS, you can also create animations, and it has a pretty robust system for doing that. So you can pull up documentation for CSS animation. I just want to run through, let's do like a pulsing one, where when I load the page, this click button should like scale up and scale back down, scale up, scale back down. So the way that we do that, CSS animations, are to define some keyframes and give them a name. So I'm saying this animation is called pulse, and here are its keyframes. And you can define at a number of different times. So I could define something where it starts at 0% of the animation to 100% of the way through the animation. I could also like create some styles that apply to 20% and 40%. However many different states we needed, we could go ahead and define them in here. Here for a pulse, all I really need to do is have a start and a finish. So at 0%, I'm going to do a transform scale 1, rotate 0 degrees. And for 100%, we will do, let's just copy this. Actually, let's have it scale up to 1.1 and rotate 5 degrees. So right now we've defined an animation, but we actually haven't applied it anywhere. So if I go back to my click button here, the way that we apply it is with the animation property. So I can say, go ahead and use the pulse animation keyframes that we've defined. Let's have it run in 1 second. So it'll take 1 second to go from 0 to 100%. Let's have it run infinitely repeating. And let's also have it alternate reverse, which means that when it gets to 100%, it should now keep running and go to 0%. So we got this one button that responds as we hover over it, and we've got this other one that has like a dynamic animation happening. These aren't the most useful pieces of user interface, but it's fun to play with transitions and to play with animations. So I know that was a lot in terms of crash course into CSS, and we kind of touched on the surface of a lot of different properties, and there are a whole lot of properties that we didn't talk about and features of CSS that we didn't talk about. So again, with all of this, keep those references handy. So if you're curious about CSS animations, Google search CSS animations and there will be great references. If you're curious about other things you can do with your transform, Google search CSS transform. MDN has a great reference. W3 Schools has a great reference. So I'm giving you the skeleton. that then you can run out in the world and sort of research the aspects that are interesting to you or the aspects that are interesting to the design that you're trying to create. And we will continue to dive deeper as we build more and more together into different aspects of CSS, like, for instance, how to lay things out like a grid. So that's it for this video, and next time we'll talk about JavaScript.